The morning sun cast long shadows across the Pentagon's massive parking lot as Admiral Rebecca Harrison walked toward the entrance of the world's largest office building. At 42 years old, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned every star on her shoulder through blood, sweat, and decisions that had saved countless lives. Her auburn hair was pulled back in the regulation style, and her dress blue uniform was immaculate, but there was something in her steel-gray eyes that suggested storms weathered and battles won. Today's meeting was supposed to be routine. The Navy's top brass was gathering to discuss budget allocations for the upcoming fiscal year, a mundane topic that usually generated more yawns than controversy. But Harrison knew better than most that in the military, routine meetings had a way of becoming anything but routine. She had arrived early, as was her habit. Harrison believed that punctuality was more than just good manners, it was a tactical advantage. Being first in the room gave her time to assess the terrain, both physical and political. As she entered conference room 2A372, she noted the usual setup, a massive mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs that had witnessed decades of decisions affecting America's naval forces. The room began filling up slowly. Admiral James Bull Morrison entered first, his heavy footsteps announcing his presence before he even crossed the threshold. Morrison was old-school Navy, a submarine commander who had cut his teeth during the final years of the Cold War. He nodded curtly at Harrison before taking his usual seat at the far end of the table. Next came Admiral Patricia Chen, a logistics specialist whose brilliant mind had revolutionized naval supply chains across 3 continents. Chen offered Harrison a warm smile and chose the seat directly across from her. They had worked together on several joint operations, and Chen was one of the few people in the room who truly understood the scope of Harrison's contributions to modern naval warfare. As the minutes ticked by, more officers filled the remaining chairs. Admiral Thomas Tank Rodriguez, a surface warfare specialist known for his aggressive tactics and even more aggressive personality. Admiral Sarah Mitchell, an aviation expert who had commanded 3 different carrier groups. Admiral David Park, an intelligence officer whose quiet demeanor masked one of the sharpest analytical minds in the service. But it was the entrance of Rear Admiral Marcus Shark Thompson that caused the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. Thompson was everything that old guard naval officers thought a commander should be: tall, broad-shouldered, with a booming voice and an ego to match. He had earned his nickname not for his tactical brilliance, but for his tendency to attack anyone he perceived as weak or unworthy of their rank. Thompson had made no secret of his feelings about the Navy's increasing emphasis on diversity and inclusion. He believed that combat leadership was a man's job, and he had spent the better part of his career making sure everyone around him knew exactly where he stood on that issue. The fact that Harrison had been promoted to admiral at such a young age, and over several male officers with more traditional combat records, rankled him deeply. As Thompson settled into his chair, he began the ritual that had become his trademark, the casual conversation that was really an interrogation designed to establish dominance. He started with Admiral Park, asking about recent intelligence assessments in the South China Sea. The questions were sharp, professional, but delivered with the kind of intensity that made it clear Thompson was looking for weaknesses to exploit. Harrison watched the performance with the detached interest of someone who had seen this particular show many times before. She had encountered officers like Thompson throughout her career, men who confused volume with leadership and aggression with competence. What made Thompson particularly dangerous was that he was actually quite skilled at his job when he wasn't busy trying to prove his superiority over everyone else in the room. The meeting officially began with Admiral Morrison calling for attention and launching into the budget presentation. For the next hour, the assembled officers discussed funding priorities, personnel allocations, and equipment needs with the kind of detailed focus that kept the world's most powerful Navy operating at peak efficiency. Harrison contributed to the discussion when her expertise was relevant, offering insights on anti-submarine warfare capabilities and coastal defense strategies. Her comments were precise, well-informed, and delivered with the kind of quiet authority that came from years of making life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure. Several times, other officers nodded in agreement or asked follow-up questions that showed they respected her judgment. But Thompson remained silent during the formal proceedings, watching Harrison with the calculating gaze of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment came during the coffee break, when the formal structure of the meeting dissolved into smaller clusters of conversation. Thompson approached the coffee station where Harrison was refilling her cup, his movement deliberate and calculated. He was flanked by two of his longtime associates, commanders who shared his worldview and served as his loyal chorus in these informal encounters. The conversation started innocuously enough. Thompson asked about Harrison's thoughts on the budget allocations, then shifted to questions about personnel readiness in her command. But Harrison could sense the direction this was heading. She had been through enough of these encounters to recognize the setup. Other officers began drifting toward their conversation, drawn by some invisible signal that promised entertainment. Within minutes, most of the room's occupants had formed a loose circle around Thompson and Harrison, their conversations dying down as they focused on what was clearly becoming the main event. Thompson took a sip of his coffee and smiled the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. His voice carried the casual tone of someone making friendly conversation, but everyone in the room understood they were witnessing something far more significant. The question, when it finally came, was delivered with surgical precision. Thompson had chosen his words carefully, crafting an inquiry that sounded reasonable on the surface but carried multiple layers of implication and challenge beneath. Harrison set down her coffee cup and looked directly at Thompson. She had faced enemy fire, made split-second decisions that determined the fate of entire missions, and navigated the treacherous waters of military politics for over 2 decades. This moment was no different from any other tactical situation she had encountered, except that the battlefield was a Pentagon conference room and the weapons were words instead of missiles. What happened next would be discussed in naval circles for years to come, analyzed and debated by military historians, and ultimately become part of the legend that surrounded one of the most extraordinary careers in modern naval history. But, in that moment, as Admiral Rebecca Harrison prepared to respond to Rear Admiral Thompson's challenge, the only thing that mattered was the truth. The silence that followed Thompson's question seemed to stretch for an eternity, though in reality it lasted only a few seconds. Harrison's mind raced through the implications of what had just been asked and the various ways she could respond. She could deflect with humor, cite classification restrictions, or simply refuse to engage with what was clearly an attempt to diminish her standing among her peers. But Rebecca Harrison hadn't risen to the rank of admiral by backing down from confrontations or allowing others to define the terms of engagement. If Thompson wanted to discuss kill counts, she would give him exactly what he had asked for, though perhaps not in the way he had anticipated. She straightened her shoulders slightly, a movement so subtle that only the most observant officers in the room noticed it. When she spoke, her voice carried the same measured tone she had used during the formal meeting, but there was an undertone of steel that suggested the conversation was about to take a very different direction. "That's an interesting question, Marcus," she began, using Thompson's first name rather than his rank, a small but significant breach of protocol that immediately shifted the power dynamic in the room. "But, before I answer, I think it's important that we're all clear about what we mean by kill count and why it matters." Harrison paused, letting her words sink in while she scanned the faces around her. Admiral Chen was watching with the kind of focused attention that suggested she knew something significant was about to happen. Admiral Morrison had set down his coffee cup and was leaning forward slightly, his expression unreadable. The younger officers in the room seemed to sense that they were witnessing something important, though they couldn't quite put their finger on what it was. "You see," Harrison continued, "there are different ways to measure effectiveness in combat. There's the Hollywood version, where success is measured by how many enemy soldiers you personally kill with your own weapon. Then, there's the strategic version, where success is measured by objectives achieved, missions completed, and lives saved on your own side." Thompson's smile faltered slightly, but he maintained his aggressive posture. "Come on, Rebecca," he said, his use of her first name intended to sound casual but carrying an undertone of condescension. "We all know what I'm asking about. Direct action. Combat leadership under fire. The kind of experience that separates the real warriors from the desk jockeys. The room was now completely silent except for the hum of the air conditioning system. Harrison could feel the weight of every gaze focused on her, could sense the mixture of curiosity, concern, and anticipation that filled the space between the assembled officers. What Thompson didn't know, what none of them knew except for Admiral Chen and a handful of others with the highest security clearances, was that Harrison's combat record was unlike anything in modern naval history. Her missions had been so classified, her operations so far beyond the normal scope of naval warfare, that most of her actual achievements couldn't be discussed in a room like this, even among officers with top-secret clearances. Harrison had spent the early part of her career in what the Navy euphemistically called Special Operations Coordination. In practice, this meant she had been part of a small, elite group of officers who worked directly with SEAL teams, Delta Force units, and other special operations forces on missions that officially didn't exist. She had planned and executed operations in hostile waters off the coasts of 3 continents. She had coordinated naval support for special forces operations that had prevented terrorist attacks on American soil. She had been in the command center during raids that had eliminated some of the world's most dangerous criminals and enemy operatives. But the mission that had really defined her career, the operation that had earned her the respect of every special operations commander she had ever worked with, was something that had happened 3 years earlier in the waters off Somalia. It was an operation so sensitive that even now, even among this group of trusted naval officers, she couldn't discuss the details. All she could say was that her tactical decisions during that mission had saved the lives of 43 American servicemen and had eliminated a threat that could have destabilized the entire Horn of Africa. The operation had been a masterpiece of coordination between multiple military branches, intelligence agencies, and allied forces. And, yes, people had died as a direct result of her orders. Enemy combatants who had chosen to engage American forces in deadly combat had paid the ultimate price for that choice. But the real measure of Harrison's success wasn't in the enemies who had been killed, it was in the Americans who had come home alive. Thompson was still waiting for her answer, his expression growing more impatient by the second. The other officers in the room maintained their respectful silence, but Harrison could sense that the tension was building toward a breaking point. "You want to know about my kill count," Harrison said finally, her voice carrying a new edge that hadn't been there before. "That's a fair question, I suppose. But, let me ask you something first, Marcus. What's your definition of success in combat? Is it the number of enemies you kill, or is it the number of your own people who make it home safely?" Thompson's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected to be questioned in return, and he clearly didn't appreciate having his own combat philosophy challenged in front of his peers. "Obviously, the primary goal is mission success and the safety of our personnel," he said, his voice becoming more formal and defensive. "But combat leadership requires personal courage and direct engagement with the enemy. It requires the kind of experience that can only be gained through actual warfare." Harrison nodded slowly, as if considering his words carefully. "I agree completely," she said. "Combat leadership does require personal courage and direct engagement. It requires making split-second decisions that determine whether people live or die. It requires the ability to coordinate multiple moving pieces in a fluid, dangerous environment where a single mistake can cost lives." She paused again, and this time the silence felt different. It wasn't the awkward quiet of an uncomfortable confrontation, it was the focused attention of people who realized they were about to learn something important. "But, here's what I've learned about kill counts," Harrison continued. "The officers who talk about them the most are usually the ones who have the least to be proud of. The ones who really understand combat, who have really been tested under fire, don't measure their worth by how many people they've killed. They measure it by how many people they've saved." Thompson's face was beginning to redden, but, before he could respond, Harrison held up a hand to indicate she wasn't finished. "You asked for my kill count," she said. "I'm going to give it to you. But, I want everyone in this room to understand that what I'm about to tell you represents some of the darkest and most difficult moments of my career. these aren't trophies or bragging rights. They're reminders of the price of freedom and the responsibility that comes with command. The room had become so quiet that Harrison could hear the distant sound of traffic from the Pentagon's parking lot. Every officer present seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for what was clearly going to be a revelation that would change their understanding of the woman standing before them. Harrison looked directly at Thompson, her gray eyes reflecting the kind of steely determination that had carried her through some of the most dangerous waters in the world. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of years of classified operations and split-second decisions that had shaped the course of international conflicts. Operation Neptune's Shield, she said, the words falling into the silence like stones dropped into still water. Somalia, 3 years ago. My direct orders resulted in the elimination of 17 enemy combatants who were holding 43 American servicemen hostage. Admiral Morrison straightened in his chair. He knew about Neptune's Shield, at least the declassified portions of it. It had been one of the most successful counterterrorism operations in recent naval history, but the details remained locked away in files that only a handful of people had access to. The hostages were being held on 3 different vessels spread across a 15-mile area of hostile waters, Harrison continued. The enemy had surface-to-air missiles, high-powered speedboats, and enough explosive material to turn those ships into floating bombs. Intelligence indicated they were planning to execute the hostages at dawn and use the footage for propaganda purposes. Thompson's expression had changed from smug confidence to focused attention. This wasn't the kind of story he had expected to hear, and he was beginning to realize that he might have underestimated his target. Harrison began walking slowly around the room as she spoke, her hands clasped behind her back in the classic military posture. Her voice remained calm and controlled, but there was an intensity in her movements that suggested she was reliving every moment of that night. I had 2 destroyer escorts, a submarine, and a SEAL team at my disposal, she said. But the enemy positions were too well defended for a conventional assault. Any direct approach would have resulted in the immediate execution of the hostages and significant casualties among our forces. She paused in front of the window that looked out over the Potomac River, her gaze seeming to focus on something far beyond the peaceful Virginia landscape. So I developed what the mission reports later called an unconventional tactical approach, Harrison continued. But what it really was a plan that required me to make 17 human beings disappear from the face of the earth in the space of 47 minutes. Admiral Chen leaned forward slightly, her expression showing the kind of professional interest that came from understanding the complexity of coordinating multiple military assets in a hostile environment. She had read the classified after-action reports from Neptune's Shield, and she knew that Harrison was describing one of the most brilliant tactical operations in recent military history. The plan required precise timing and perfect coordination between surface vessels, underwater assets, and special operations forces, Harrison explained. I positioned the destroyers to create what appeared to be a standard blockade formation, which drew the enemy's attention and most of their defensive fire. Meanwhile, the submarine approached the target vessels from below, using a technique that had never been attempted in actual combat conditions. Thompson was now completely focused on Harrison's words, his earlier swagger replaced by the kind of intense concentration that serious military officers brought to discussions of tactical innovation. At exactly 0347 hours, the submarine launched a coordinated strike that disabled the engines and communications equipment on all 3 enemy vessels simultaneously, Harrison said. This created a 30-minute window during which the enemy couldn't call for reinforcements or escape, but they also couldn't surrender because they no longer had functioning radio equipment. She turned away from the window and faced the room again, her expression showing the weight of the decisions she was describing. That's when the SEAL teams went to work, Harrison continued. They had practiced the assault hundreds of times, but never under actual combat conditions with real hostages at risk. Every movement had to be perfect. Every shot had to count. There was no room for error. Admiral Park, the intelligence specialist, nodded slightly. He understood the kind of pressure Harrison was describing, the impossible weight of knowing that a single miscalculation could result in the deaths of dozens of American servicemen. The operation took exactly 47 minutes from start to finish, Harrison said. When it was over, all 43 hostages were safe and on their way back to American vessels. The enemy combatants were eliminated with surgical precision, 17 individuals who had chosen to engage in warfare against the United States and had paid the ultimate price for that choice. She walked back to her original position near the coffee station, her movements deliberate and controlled. When she spoke again, her voice carried a new intensity that made it clear she wasn't finished with her response to Thompson's original question. "But, here's what the mission reports don't tell you," Harrison said. "Here's what you really want to know when you ask about kill counts. Every single one of those 17 deaths weighs on me. Not because I regret the decision or question whether it was necessary, but because taking a human life, even in combat, even when it's completely justified, changes you in ways that most people can't understand." The room remained silent, but Harrison could sense that the atmosphere had shifted again. The officers around her were no longer watching a confrontation between two competing egos. They were listening to a combat veteran describe the reality of command decisions that carried life and death consequences. "I've been in command during 6 major operations over the past 8 years, Harrison continued. Operations in the Mediterranean, the Pacific, and the Indian Ocean. Operations that officially never happened but that kept Americans safe and prevented conflicts that could have escalated into something much worse." She looked directly at Thompson again, but now her gaze carried no anger or defensiveness. Instead, there was something that looked almost like pity. "My direct orders have resulted in the deaths of 31 enemy combatants," Harrison said. "But, more importantly, those same orders have saved the lives of over 200 American servicemen and women who might otherwise not have made it home to their families." Thompson opened his mouth to respond, but Harrison held up a hand to indicate she wasn't finished. "And here's what you need to understand about those numbers," she said. "Every single one of those deaths was a last resort. Every single one of those operations was designed to minimize casualties on both sides while achieving the necessary tactical objectives. Because real combat leadership isn't about how many people you can kill. It's about how many people you can save." The silence that followed was different from anything that had come before. It wasn't the uncomfortable quiet of an awkward confrontation or the tense anticipation of people waiting for a revelation. It was the respectful silence of people who had just been given a glimpse into a level of responsibility and decision-making that few of them would ever experience. Admiral Morrison was the first to break the silence, his deep voice cutting through the tension that had filled the room. "Admiral Harrison," he said, his tone carrying a level of respect that hadn't been there at the beginning of the conversation, "I think I speak for everyone here when I say that your operational record speaks for itself." But Harrison wasn't finished. She could see that Thompson was still processing what he had heard, still trying to reconcile his preconceptions about female officers with the reality of the combat veteran standing before him. More importantly, she realized that this moment represented an opportunity to address something much larger than one man's outdated attitudes. "There's something else I want to share," Harrison said, her voice taking on a different quality, something that sounded almost like vulnerability. "Something that goes beyond operational statistics and tactical achievements." She moved to the center of the room, positioning herself so that she could make eye contact with every officer present. When she continued, her words carried the weight of personal experience and hard-earned wisdom. 3 months ago, I received a letter from the wife of Petty Officer Daniel Martinez, Harrison said. Martinez was one of the hostages rescued during Operation Neptune's Shield. The letter was brief, just 2 paragraphs, but it contained something that mattered more to me than every medal and commendation I've ever received. Admiral Chen nodded slightly, understanding immediately where this was heading. She had been in command positions long enough to know that the real rewards of military service weren't found in official recognition or career advancement, but in the knowledge that your decisions had made a difference in the lives of real people. Martinez's wife wrote to thank me for bringing her husband home, Harrison continued. But what she really wanted me to know was that her husband had been there for the birth of their daughter 2 weeks after his rescue. She wanted me to know that because of the decisions made during that operation, their little girl would grow up knowing her father. The emotion in Harrison's voice was subtle but unmistakable. Several of the officers in the room shifted uncomfortably, not because they disagreed with what she was saying, but because they recognized the profound responsibility that came with command decisions in life-or-death situations. That little girl will never know that her father's life was saved because I ordered the deaths of 17 enemy combatants, Harrison said. She'll never know that her father came home because a submarine crew executed a maneuver that had never been attempted in combat conditions. She'll never know that her family exists because of tactical decisions made in the middle of the night in hostile waters thousands of miles from home. Thompson had remained silent throughout Harrison's expanded explanation, but now he cleared his throat and spoke for the first time since asking his original question. When he did, his voice had lost much of its earlier swagger. "Admiral Harrison," he said, using her proper rank for the first time in the conversation, "I think I owe you an apology. My question was inappropriate and based on assumptions that I'm now realizing were completely unfounded." Harrison studied Thompson's expression, looking for any sign that his apparent change of heart was merely tactical positioning rather than genuine recognition. What she saw surprised her. The arrogance was still there, but it was now tempered by something that looked like actual respect. "No apology necessary," Harrison replied. "Your question gave me an opportunity to address something that I think needs to be discussed more openly in our leadership circles." She turned to address the room as a whole, her posture straightening as she shifted into what was clearly going to be a more formal presentation of her thoughts. "We have a problem in the modern military," Harrison said. "We've created a culture where combat experience is measured by the wrong metrics. We celebrate aggression over strategy, individual achievement over team success, and body counts over mission accomplishment." Admiral Park leaned forward, his analytical mind clearly engaged by what he was hearing. As an intelligence officer, he had seen firsthand how this kind of thinking could lead to strategic failures and unnecessary casualties. "The most dangerous enemies we face today aren't going to be defeated by traditional warfare," Harrison continued. "They're going to be defeated by officers who understand that victory in the 21st century requires intelligence, coordination, technological superiority, and the ability to achieve maximum impact with minimum collateral damage." She began walking around the room again, but this time her movement seemed less like nervous energy and more like a teacher making sure she had the attention of every student in the class. "The officer who can eliminate a terrorist cell without killing a single civilian is more valuable than the officer who can destroy an entire city block," Harrison said. "The commander who can achieve strategic objectives without losing a single member of their own forces is more effective than the commander who wins through attrition and acceptable losses." Thompson nodded slowly, and, for the first time since the conversation began, Harrison saw something in his expression that suggested he was genuinely considering her perspective rather than simply waiting for his turn to respond. "But there's an even more important point," Harrison continued. "The kind of combat leadership that wins wars in the modern era requires skills that have nothing to do with gender, physical strength, or traditional military bearing. It requires intelligence, creativity, the ability to process complex information under pressure, and the capacity to coordinate multiple assets in rapidly changing situations." Admiral Mitchell, the aviation specialist, spoke up for the first time. "Admiral Harrison, are you suggesting that our current promotion and evaluation systems are failing to identify and develop the kind of leadership we need for future conflicts?" Harrison smiled slightly, pleased that Mitchell had asked exactly the question she had been hoping someone would raise. "I'm suggesting that we need to fundamentally rethink how we define combat effectiveness," Harrison replied. "We need to move beyond outdated concepts of warrior culture and start recognizing that the most important battles of the next 50 years are going to be won by officers who can think strategically, adapt quickly, and coordinate resources in ways that our enemies can't predict or counter." The room had become a forum for serious discussion rather than an arena for personal confrontation. Officers who had been silent observers were now leaning forward, engaged by what had become an impromptu seminar on modern military leadership. The enemy combatants I've faced in my career weren't defeated by superior firepower or individual heroics, Harrison said. They were defeated by superior planning, better intelligence, more effective coordination, and tactical innovations that they couldn't anticipate or respond to effectively. She paused, letting her words sink in before delivering what she clearly intended to be her closing argument. So when someone asks me about my kill count, I want them to understand that the number itself is almost irrelevant, Harrison said. What matters is that every one of those deaths served a larger purpose, achieved a strategic objective, and contributed to victories that made America safer and brought our people home alive. The transformation in the room was remarkable. What had begun as a coffee break confrontation had evolved into the kind of strategic discussion that the Pentagon's senior leadership desperately needed to have more often. Officers who had entered the room with fixed ideas about combat leadership were now grappling with concepts that challenged everything they thought they knew about military effectiveness. Admiral Morrison stood up slowly, his movement commanding immediate attention from everyone present. As the senior officer in the room, his response to Harrison's presentation would set the tone for how her words would be received and remembered. Admiral Harrison, Morrison said, his voice carrying the gravitas that came from 4 decades of naval service, what you've described represents a fundamental shift in how we think about military leadership. But, I have to ask the obvious question, how do we implement these ideas within an institution that has been built around very different concepts of combat effectiveness? Harrison had been waiting for exactly this question. She understood that inspiring speeches were worthless without practical applications, and she had spent years developing specific recommendations for how the Navy could adapt to the realities of modern warfare. The answer starts with how we evaluate officers for promotion and command positions, Harrison replied. We need to weight strategic thinking, technological competence, and coordination abilities much more heavily than we currently do. An officer who can successfully manage a complex multi-platform operation should be valued more highly than an officer whose primary qualification is personal courage under fire. Thompson, who had been listening intently throughout Harrison's extended presentation, raised his hand slightly to indicate he wanted to speak. When Harrison nodded for him to proceed, his words surprised everyone in the room. I've been thinking about what you said regarding civilian casualties and collateral damage, Thompson said. In my own career, I've always focused on mission completion and force protection, but I'm realizing that I may have overlooked the strategic importance of how we achieve our objectives. Harrison nodded approvingly. Thompson's willingness to acknowledge the limitations of his own perspective represented exactly the kind of intellectual flexibility that modern naval leadership required. The strategic environment we're operating in today is completely different from what it was even 10 years ago, Harrison explained. Every operation is conducted under intense scrutiny from media, political leadership, and allied forces. An operation that achieves tactical success but creates negative publicity or strains diplomatic relationships can actually be considered a strategic failure. Admiral Chen had been taking notes throughout the discussion, her logistical mind clearly working through the practical implications of what Harrison was describing. Now she looked up from her notepad and asked the question that was on everyone's mind. Admiral Harrison, you've described a new paradigm for combat leadership, but you've also shared some very specific examples from your own operational experience. How do we ensure that other officers have the opportunity to develop similar skills and experience? Harrison smiled, recognizing that Chen had identified the crucial challenge facing the Navy's leadership development programs. It was one thing to identify the skills that future commanders would need, it was something else entirely to create training programs and career paths that would develop those skills effectively. We need to completely restructure our approach to officer development, Harrison said. Instead of focusing primarily on traditional warfare scenarios, we need to emphasize joint operations, interagency coordination, and complex problem-solving under ambiguous conditions. She walked over to the whiteboard that occupied one wall of the conference room and picked up a marker. Without asking permission, she began sketching a diagram that illustrated her vision for modern naval officer development. Traditional officer training follows a linear progression, Harrison said as she drew. surface warfare, submarine operations, aviation, staff assignments, command positions. But, the kind of leadership we need for future conflicts requires exposure to intelligence operations, special forces coordination, diplomatic protocols, and technological innovation. The diagram she was creating showed interconnected pathways rather than linear progression, with multiple opportunities for officers to gain experience in non-traditional roles before advancing to senior command positions. The officers who will be most effective in future conflicts are the ones who understand how naval assets fit into larger strategic frameworks, Harrison continued. They need to understand how their decisions affect not just immediate tactical outcomes, but long-term strategic objectives, allied relationships, and domestic political considerations. Admiral Park had been studying Harrison's diagram with the intense focus he usually reserved for intelligence briefings. Now he looked up with the expression of someone who had just grasped the implications of what he was seeing. "You're describing a fundamental change in military culture," Park said. "You're talking about creating officers who are part warrior, part diplomat, part technologist, and part strategic analyst." Harrison set down the marker and turned to face the room. "Exactly," she said. "Because that's what effective military leadership looks like in the 21st century. The days when we could succeed through superior firepower and traditional tactics are over. Our enemies have adapted, and we need to adapt even faster." The discussion continued for another 30 minutes, with officers asking detailed questions about specific aspects of Harrison's proposals. The energy in the room had completely shifted from confrontation to collaboration, with everyone present clearly recognizing that they were participating in a conversation that could influence naval policy for years to come. As the meeting finally began to wind down, Thompson approached Harrison privately while the other officers were gathering their materials and preparing to return to their regular duties. "Admiral Harrison," Thompson said, his voice carrying none of the swagger that had characterized his earlier comments, "I want you to know that I've learned something important today. Not just about modern warfare or military leadership, but about my own limitations and biases." Harrison studied Thompson's expression, looking for any sign of insincerity. What she saw was a career officer who had just been forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about his own assumptions and prejudices. "I appreciate that," Harrison replied. "But I hope you also understand that the changes we've been discussing aren't just about recognizing different leadership styles or being more inclusive. They're about survival. The Navy that fails to adapt to modern realities is the Navy that loses the next major conflict." Thompson nodded slowly. "I understand that now," he said. "And I want you to know that you have my support for whatever initiatives you think are necessary to implement these changes." As the room gradually emptied, Harrison found herself alone with Admiral Morrison, who had remained behind to discuss the logistical details of turning their conversation into actionable policy recommendations. "Rebecca," Morrison said, using her first name in a way that indicated respect rather than condescension, "what happened here today needs to reach the highest levels of naval leadership. Secretary of the Navy, Chief of Naval Operations, maybe even the Joint Chiefs. Are you prepared for that level of attention and responsibility?" Harrison looked out the window at the Potomac River, thinking about the young officers currently serving on ships around the world, facing threats that their training had never prepared them for. She thought about the families who were counting on those officers to make the right decisions under impossible circumstances. And she thought about the little girl whose father had come home because of tactical innovations that had never been attempted before in actual combat. "Yes," she said simply. "I'm prepared for whatever level of responsibility is necessary to ensure that our people have the leadership they deserve." 6 months later, Admiral Rebecca Harrison was nominated for promotion to the newly created position of Assistant Chief of Naval Operations for Strategic Innovation. Her confirmation hearing before the Senate Armed Services Committee would later be described as one of the most important discussions of military reform in a generation. But, for those who were present in Conference Room 2A372 that day, the real significance wasn't in the policy changes that followed or the institutional reforms that Harrison would eventually implement. It was in the moment when a simple question about kill counts became a lesson about what true leadership meant in the modern world. The story of Admiral Harrison's response to Rear Admiral Thompson's challenge became legendary within naval circles, passed down through generations of officers as an example of how real combat leaders handle confrontation and how authentic experience speaks louder than any amount of posturing or bravado. Years later, when young officers asked Harrison about that day, she would always emphasize the same point: the most important victories aren't measured by the enemies you defeat, but by the people you bring home safely. It was a lesson that transformed not just individual careers, but the entire culture of American naval leadership. In the gleaming halls of the Pentagon, where military careers are made and broken with a single word, Admiral Rebecca Storm Harrison faced a room full of skeptical naval officers who thought they knew exactly what kind of leader she was. They saw her small frame, her quiet demeanor, and her tendency to let others speak first. What they didn't see coming was the moment that would redefine not just their understanding of combat leadership, but the entire Navy's approach to modern warfare. It started with what seemed like innocent locker room banter. A cocky Rear Admiral, surrounded by his loyal followers, decided to test the newest female admiral in the room. "So, Harrison," he said with a smirk that had intimidated countless junior officers, "what's your kill count? We're all curious about what kind of action you've really seen." The room fell silent. Every eye turned toward the woman who had quietly risen through the ranks faster than anyone in recent memory. Some expected her to deflect with humor. Others thought she might cite classified operations or change the subject entirely. No one, absolutely no one, was prepared for what came next. Her response didn't just stun the room into complete silence. It sent shockwaves through the highest levels of naval command, reached the desk of the Secretary of Defense within hours, and ultimately changed how the United States Navy thinks about leadership, combat effectiveness, and the true meaning of victory in modern warfare. This is the true story of Admiral Rebecca Harrison, a woman whose answer to a simple question revealed a military mind so brilliant and a combat record so extraordinary that it forced an entire institution to confront everything it thought it knew about what makes a great naval commander.